Great. Okay, if we could take our seats, we're going to get going. Thank you very much. Okay. Welcome to the University of Exeter. My name is Patrick Devine-Wright, and I'm a professor in the Geography Department, and I'm affiliated to the Global Systems Institute. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the topic, a very important topic of climate emergency. What does it mean? What's it for? What would it lead to? What might it lead to? So I just want to start very briefly by welcoming everybody here in person, and we also have a dial-in audience from Penryn, from our campus down in Cornwall. So that just demonstrates the excitement and interest in this topic at the moment, which we're very interested to see. I'm just going to say a couple of housekeeping things before passing over to Mark Goodwin here. We are not planning any kind of fire or emergency. Okay, there's enough emergency going on in what we're going to be talking about. So if you do hear an alarm, then please vacate the building, and the fire exits are the same ways that you entered, 2 at the rear and 2 on either side. Yeah, so I think without further ado, and maybe some apologies to people down in Penryn who weren't quite sure where to go in terms of signage, we'll kick off proceedings with Mark Goodwin. Maybe just to give you some idea of what's coming before I ask Mark to sit. Normally when you come to a university, you hear an academic waffling on for a long period of time in some kind of lecture format. We didn't want to do that with this evening. So what we've got is a variety of different things. We're going to start with Mark here talking about the university's position and response to the climate emergency. And then, as you can see from the slide in front of me, we're going to have some short, pithy, provocative statements by a small handful of people who we think might have some interesting things to say on the topic of climate emergency. Some of them are seated in front of us here. Some of them are waiting in the wings, about to appear to make their provocations. Now, once those short provocations are up, it's over to you guys. We're going to have a small 10-minute period where we're encouraging you to talk to the people around you. Hopefully, you can get neighborly and make friends and have a little dialogue. And your task is to come up with the questions, the tough questions that we want you to then put to the panel. Hopefully, they will be illuminated by what the provocateurs have said, but that is the meat of tonight is a Q&A session. It gives you the opportunity to think and talk and ask. So this is a public dialogue. After that, we'll simply close with some closing remarks, but there will be an opportunity to do some voting. We will put up some questions. Some of those questions we've thought of already about a climate emergency, but also they can be questions that come directly from your suggestions. And we're also asking people to tweet, hashtag ExeterClimate, if you want to comment or pose questions live as the event is going on. So that's enough for me just for now. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Professor Mark Goodwin, who's going to talk about the University of Exeter's position in response to the topic. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Patrick, and a very good evening and a very warm welcome to you all. As Patrick said, my name is Mark Goodwin, and I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University, as well as Professor of Human Geography. And it's absolutely wonderful to be here tonight in both of those capacities. On behalf of the University and the event organisers, it gives me a great pleasure to open the debate this evening, and what an incredible turnout on both sides of the Tamar. Thank you so much for coming along. The fantastic response that the team have had to this event is clear evidence of both the critical nature of the issue and the wide recognition that we really urgently need to come together to discuss what action we should take. As you may have seen, earlier this week, the university joined MPs, local authorities, wide range of other organisations in declaring an environment and climate emergency. Like them, we believe that this is an important step because, and let's be absolutely honest here, we can't overstate the issue. All the academic evidence now clearly points to the fact that the future of this planet is at stake. We know, though, that simply declaring an environment and climate emergency is not enough. The environmental challenges the world faces require leadership, investment, organizational and structural transformation, and human behavior change on a scale that we've never seen before. And at the University of Exeter, we're incredibly proud to host some of the best teams in the world, if not the best teams in the world, working on climate change and the environment. These involve well over 250 of our academics across several of our disciplines, including in our new Global Systems Institute, who are hosting tonight's event. And as an organization, we want to harness and learn from this expertise so that we can go further and faster in tackling environmental and climate change. We've been inspired by the hundreds of our staff, our students, and members of our local communities who've written to us. And we want to grasp the opportunity, indeed I go further and say grasp the obligation, right now to show greater leadership in tackling the climate emergency that faces all of us. So we've therefore announced the establishment of a team led by Professor Juliet Osborne, the director of our Environment and Sustainability Institute in Cornwall, to bring together a group of our leading academics, other staff, some of our students, to develop a plan of action for the university, a plan that will have true substance and which we can use to measure our actions in this area, focusing on the evidence and on the science. And we're certainly not starting from scratch. Professor Tim Lenton and other colleagues, such as those that you'll see on the panels this evening, have been urging us forward on this agenda for many years. In September 2018, the university announced its commitment to a target of a 50% reduction in energy-related carbon emissions by 2026 when compared to 2005-6. And as part of this commitment, the university approved the first phase of its 2016 to 2026 low-carbon commitment implementation plan, which includes solar PV installation, energy-efficient lighting, upgraded insulation, and boiler replacements to be delivered across the next 2 years. We'll be revisiting our targets and our implementation plan as part of our response to the environment and climate emergency. We want to establish Exeter as an exemplar and leader in the next phase of our ambition, consistent with our international academic reputation. And Professor Osborne's group will therefore be tackling key issues informed by our research knowledge, including how we create a challenging but achievable long-term carbon management strategy to reduce direct emissions from energy use as rapidly as we possibly can, to identify further substantial transformative actions that the university will take to reduce our wider impacts on the environment and the climate, looking at areas such as our procurement, our waste management, and our travel policies. And they'll also be reviewing our current approach to environmental sustainability, and they'll be prioritizing those areas requiring the most urgent attention. So we're absolutely determined that this work will lead to extensive and rapid change, and that through it, we'll bring people together from across the university and across our wider communities, both in Exeter and in Cornwall, including policymakers at many different levels from many local organisations. And events like this one, as I said, hosted by our Global Systems Institute, will be incredibly important because we can only tackle these massive issues if we come together and discuss them together and work together. Our broad mission at the University of Exeter is to make the exceptional happen by challenging traditional thinking and defying conventional boundaries. And boy, there's no greater challenge today than addressing the environment and climate emergency. So we intend to play a full part in leading the changes required, locally, nationally, and globally. These changes are going to challenge every element of our lives, make no mistake. And stating our intention to make these changes, we're very aware, is just the beginning. The thinking through them and the hard work to take actions is yet to be done. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing your ideas this evening, which will help inform our next steps. So I hope you'll find the discussion tonight interesting and valuable, and I'd like to thank the Global Systems Institute, Transition Exeter, and the Exeter Community Energy team for organising it. So I'd now like to hand over to our chair for the evening, another Professor of Human Geography, Patrick Devine-Wright. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. So, if we want to find out about the origins of this evening's talk, we need to go back several weeks. A small meeting took place between myself, Gill Westcott, who's sitting beside me here from Transitions Exeter, and Andy Richards, who's one of the GSI team. We organized a talk at the university a couple of months ago in which Natalie Bennett, the Green MP, gave an address and responded to questions over a 2-hour period. After that, I thought it was one of the most well-attended and engaged events that we'd had with members of the public. But we actually have a different scale of audience tonight. And when we met a couple of weeks ago, our idea was maybe we'll do something around energy transitions, something to do with changing our energy infrastructure. But I was adamant at the time that the climate emergency idea was so important and was such a potential pivot point for our society and for other societies that it really needed and merited further interrogation. It's easy to change the words, but what difference does it make? How important is it to change the normative framing of climate change to an emergency? Will it mean that the voices who've been calling for change for decades are listened to more than they have been in the past? It seems to me that a university is an absolutely appropriate context for that kind of discussion to take place. When I go back to the time of my life when I was a teenager, the same age as the students who are marching on Fridays, and Greta Thunberg, who has taken an amazing leadership role over the last few months on climate change, when I go back to the person I was at that time, the university represented an escape to some degree, but an ideal. I had the idea of a few people sitting around, probably wearing corduroy trousers and tweed suits in a book-lined room, discussing esoteric philosophical ideas together. And for me, that had a powerful appeal, a place where deepest intellectual contributions could take place and were allowed to take place and promoted. Now, when I went through my own studies as a PhD student and a master's student in environmental psychology at the University of Surrey, I realized that academia wasn't actually like that at all. And that a lot of other agendas were in play, and that in many ways, universities are no different from other institutions in society, and embedded with the same struggles and competitions over power and status and hierarchy, and also led by some of the same values, that bigger is better, that having a global reach is more important than anything else, and encouraging partnerships which lead to flying. In my 10 years at the university, I have taken scores of short and long-haul flights for work purposes. How sustainable is it for us to continue as a university to act in that way in the future? I'm not sure. So tonight's event represents a different kind of university, what we call a civic university, where there is direct and strong collaboration between the university and its partners from local to global scales. So in addition to my academic work here, I'm involved in an organization called Exeter Community Energy. And it's a small organization largely composed of volunteers, which is trying to develop solar and other renewable energy technologies in the locality, and also to tackle fuel poverty and vulnerability, but in a way that strengthens community in the process. It doesn't see technologies as outside of society and community issues. Similarly, we've got Transitions Exeter here. And working in collaboration with organizations like that, either local or non-local, is what a civic university is all about. So having a public dialogue, recognizing that all of you in the room have got just as much to say and just as much expertise in some ways as climate scientists who are incredibly numerous and clever about those things, is a fundamental for starting the kind of conversations we're having tonight. Because social transformation is needed as much as technologies or anything else in a process of a climate emergency. So I hope that gives you some kind of background as to why we're here and what kind of thing we're trying to do here, which is to reach across that ivory tower idea to this idea of a place where we can come together and have a respectful and have an opportunity to talk and to listen at the same time to each other, to further our own understanding and maybe change the world at the same time. An engaged university where the boundaries between the city and the university are blurred, and everybody is welcome on those terms. So what we thought we'd do to start off is to have a series, as I said, of short provocations. And we have an eminent list of individuals lined up to do that. And the whole panel represents this idea of reaching across. So we have some academics here, people who are very learned and prominent in their own fields, but we also have representatives of different generations in the face of Sophie. So I would like to hand over to Sophie now, to somebody who's growing into a context of climate emergency, and ask you to say a few words to try and stimulate our conversations going on. Over to you, Sophie.
I actually have three provocations because I can basically whittle them down. So I'm going to start off with votes at 16. It may seem far-fetched to say that to solve the climate crisis, we need to extend the voting age to 16. But if there's anything the youth strikes have shown, it's that the voice of the future is alive and kicking. At the current, the future is an empty void in which we can dump the waste of the present. But the youth's repeated calls for action and change prove they need to be taken seriously in the democratic process. And furthermore, if the youth are voting, parties will be forced to appeal to a whole new voting bloc of environmentally minded young people, hopefully pushing policies in the right direction. And as well as an extension of the voting rights, activists in the UK Student Climate Network are calling for the formation of youth climate assemblies. These will engage a cross-section of the youth to partake in the decision made around climate change. And my second point is about culture. Can we solve the climate crisis with culture, or are we too far rooted in consumerism to find a way out? At present, trying to get the world to go vegan or stop driving seems like an impossible task. But to truly encourage everyone to make the drastic lifestyle changes needed to decarbonise, we must reframe how we view such choices. We need to put across that saving the planet can be a creative process, can be what we need to restore our polarised and fractured communities, and can be fun. We need to engage everyone in a bottom-up social and cultural change which emphasises the strength of local communities so that people are less inclined to give way to material values and more likely to protect their local wildlife. We need to work together to deconstruct the growth economy and restore our landscapes. When we were fighting a war, the collective spirit was great. How can we create such a spirit again without the violence of the first time around? And my third point is about a Green New Deal. To decarbonise completely by 2030, we must overturn our current view of the economy. Students across the country have been calling for a Green New Deal. This is a radical economic plan to remove carbon from the economy whilst creating thousands of environmentally sound jobs and protecting workers' and communities' rights. Therefore, the entire country must be involved in the restructuring of our economy, and to this, citizens and youth assemblies are required, as well as traditional governmental bodies. This is one of the key demands of the UK Student Climate Network. Is this necessary? Is this possible? Can we save the planet and maintain a growth economy, or do we need a complete change?
Thank you, Sophie, for ably kicking us off. There will be opportunities for questions later, obviously, so take some notes and we'll come back to that. And Sophie's going to be sitting on our panel during the Q&A, so she won't be going anywhere. Over to our second provocateur, Professor Pierre Friedlingstein from the University of Exeter.
I need the slides.
Yeah, I think so.
Just press the...
Yeah.
It's me?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So I'm Pierre Friedlingstein from Exeter University as well. I think it's a good transition because I'm going to, continue with what Sophie mentioned in the last point. We can't hear a word. Well, I need a proper microphone. No?
Use this one if you want. Yeah, just use this.
I can sit. I can sit down. Use this one. All right. This is better. Okay. So, I'll carry on and I'll talk mainly about one point which I find quite important to discuss, and I'll try to be as provocative as possible, which is, XR, Extinction Rebellion, has three main demands, right? Tell the truth, climate emergency, act now, meaning we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025, and I put it in red on my slide to mention that this is the one I will discuss briefly. And then the third one is citizens' assemblies and going beyond politics for climate actions and justice. So my question, which, Sophie, I've mentioned already, is this feasible? Can we go to net zero by 2025? Because I'm an academic, I will show you a few slides with some plots and figures and stuff, but don't worry, it won't be very, very complicated. So just to go back in time a bit, this is, well, not really, really new. As also mentioned in the introduction, we've been working as scientists and, making assessments, submit this assessment and reviewing assessments with one international body, which is called IPCC. These were approved by governments, so all governments in the world approved and knew what it was about. Nevertheless, not much happened, but that's a different question. So in IPCC, in the fifth assessment, which was published in 2013, it was written something like, okay, if you want to reach 2 degrees or to stay below 2 degrees, you need emissions to decline by 40 to 70% by 2050 and be near zero by 2100. Later on, in a more recent assessment, and this was released last year, so okay, if you want to stay below 1.5 degree now, well, of course, you need more stringent reductions in emission. They need to decline by 45% by 2030 and reach near zero by 2050, right? And recently, this month actually, the UK Committee on Climate Change published a report, which is called the Net Zero Report, saying essentially the same as IPCC, but for the UK only, and UK should have an ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to, again, net zero by 2050. Right? So where does this zero by 2025 comes from Extinction Rebellion? And is this something we can really achieve? Because 2025 is like, well, it's like tomorrow, well, to me, right? Okay, so just to put some context, this is the figure from IPCC, which is showing you on the left side temperature. The orange region is the observation, the past, and the envelopes and the blue envelopes is the future of temperature change. And if you want to stay below 1.5, which is the blue envelope, you have to drastically reduce emissions, which is on the right panel, going from present day on the left, you go straight down, and it reaches, if you can see, probably you can't really see the numbers, it reached something like, it reached zero emission by 2050. Okay, consistent, of course, with the report, right? So this is the UK emissions now, because Extinction Rebellion is about UK emissions only, and they say rightly, okay, we have a responsibility. We were the one who started this mess with John Watt and creating energy from fossil fuel about like 2 centuries ago. So we should be the first to act as well, and give more room for developing countries in terms of emission reduction. So we have to go fast. So this is the emissions from the UK, total emissions of CO2. Over the last 50 years in green. The black line is the trend for the recent years, and the red line is my simple extrapolation of where we go if we continue as we do now. And you see that if you continue as we do now, 2025.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, I'm good.
Yep.
All right, I'm halfway through, right?
Right.
So red line, end of the red line, by the end of the plot is 2025, and you can see we are nowhere near zero, right? Okay, we need to do better. Oops. Yep. That's what we need to do, all right? So as opposed to a reduction, which is about, 5 units, 5 megaton carbon per year, you need to go, 3 times as fast, 15 megaton carbon per year of reduction. And if you do this for the next 6-7 years, you may reach zero in 2025. So maybe it's possible, but it's very hard, but you just have to be 3 times more efficient than we are now, okay? Yes, but so far, most of the reduction in the emissions in the UK has happened in sectors that we, as persons, don't really control. Industries and power generation, so making electricity, and many industries. I don't have time to explain why we managed to reduce emissions in these sectors, but if you look at the ones that are really us, transport, the blue line, flight and airplane, the light blue line, and buildings, which is, heating, essentially, commercial, but also domestic heating in your house, the orange line, they are essentially flat, okay? So if you want to go to zero, for these ones that don't decline yet, you have to decline even much, much faster. You have a massive transformation that has to be happening soon for things like transportation, heating, and so on. So it makes the challenge even much harder because the sectors that are critical are not being addressed yet. So we've done the easy part, and the hard part needs to be done now. Okay, so essentially, to conclude, how can we go from the top slides from the top photos, to the bottom ones? And can we do this in 5 years? We'll see. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Good. Over to Gill.
It's very hard to listen to what is necessary in the way that we've been told. And it's very hard to take responsibility for it. We can't do it as individuals. Of course we need to change our lifestyles. Of course we want to do what we can. I think there's a 12 points somewhere, isn't there? There's a 12 points somewhere that Transition Exeter produced. I hope that you will get it eventually. But we need to do it as communities in our local area, our districts, regions, nations, and internationally. And that goes against a lot of our economic orthodoxy. It means we're going to have to do more in the collective sphere, in the public sphere. So I'm going to make 2 suggestions about how we should do that. One, that the things that have the biggest climate impact should also have the greater cost, and that the eco-friendly alternative should be the lower cost and the more convenient. And I'm also going to suggest that unless these changes are done in a way that is just and seen as just, then they won't be acceptable. So, IPCC asked 45% by 2030. Are we going to do no more than that? Are we expecting that Bangladesh, that Tanzania, that Mali will also cut their much more minimal emissions by 45%? Appropriately, it's been spoken about today already that we should cut farther and faster, and we have to do that. It takes investment and it takes planning. So, how do I do this? There we are. One way that we can do this is to use prices through taxes and subsidies to tilt the balance in favour of things that reduce our climate impact. One thing would be a carbon tax, which is not propounded only by radical lefties. This is Dieter Helm. And he, as others, say this would be one way to discourage the use of fossil fuels, encourage renewables, use of labour instead. It doesn't mean an increased burden of taxation necessarily. That should be decided in different criteria. It could replace VAT. There is a problem, though: imports and poverty. It would need a border tax, because what about cheap goods coming in from countries where they don't have a carbon tax? Would undercut domestic producers that do. We would need a border tax to level the playing field. But that would be good, because it would mean that countries that want to import to UK would also have to decarbonise their production. And it can be done by individual countries. Also, the problem is that raising energy and food prices would hit the poor much worse than those of us who are better off. So, looking back to our experience of the wartime economy and making big changes quickly, there was a need to share out basic essentials. And I think there needs to be an element of rationing in our changeover to a low-carbon and zero-carbon society. We accept this in health services, which we aim to ration according to need. And it could be true with other things as well. So the proposal here, doesn't come from me, is personal carbon allowances. So that every time we pay a fuel bill, electricity bill, or buy petrol, we have a swipe card and we get a small amount free of tax. And after that, if we buy a lot, it gets more expensive. It's quite feasible, and it could be done now, and that would be more just. A similar principle would be to have a frequent flyer levy, so that, well, as you see, most of the flights are taken by a small number of people. And Kevin Anderson, the climate scientist, speaks like you, Patrick. He's very critical of climate scientists jetting around the world. But this way, one flight would be free of tax, and then more one would pay much more heavily. I feel a bit strange about this. I haven't flown since 16 years. Why would I want to? Air emissions are the worst for climate change, 2.5 times as bad because they're up there. They cause asthma by the pollution. It hurts my kids. It hurts everybody's kids for generations to come. Why would I want to fly? I think we all need to come to a view on that. Changing over to an economy which is zero carbon, we can also learn from that change in 1939 to 40. So did the government say, well, put up the price of Spitfires and the private sector will deliver? No, that would take too long. It was organised directly. There was a lot of planning, there was a lot of organisation. Private firms, government cooperated to do that. So now we need to change to clean energy. The Committee on Climate Change has planted 1.5 billion trees. That's a lot. It's a lot of land less for sheep. Retrofit homes, clean transport. It needs direct public infrastructure investment. Sophie's talked about a Green New Deal. Yes, we need it. But it also means food will be more expensive if we use the approach of using prices. And I think we need to recognise that if the food in supermarkets ends up more expensive because of a carbon tax, it does cost more already, but we don't pay that cost. People who are flooded pay that cost. People who get ill because of the pollution pay it. And our children and future generations pay it in spades. We just don't see it in the price. So this is making it transparent if we have that change. The last thing I'm going to talk about is that we need to get over our growth obsession. Growth, it's called growth, but what is it? It's the money measure, GDP, GNP. What's that got to do with anything? It goes up if crime, pollution, insurance payouts, longer working hours, less time with families. It's not a good measure. We should measure what we want. It's not a question of growth or no growth. Let's aim for what we want. A society that's healthy, sustainable, everybody gets what they need. So I'm going to suggest what the Chancellor's budget statement could be in spring 2025. I'm sorry, some of you have heard this already. The Chancellor could stand up and she could say, first of all, I'm going to look at the capital account. It's the great economy, the natural world that we live in. She could say biosphere, measure soil fertilities going up. She could say we've more fish, bigger area of forest, the number of pollinators is greater, big applause. She could say our emissions are going down at a rate faster than ever before. People would applaud. And she could turn to the human economy. Our measures of well-being are going up. People are living longer, healthier lives. Applause. GDP's going up, going down. Wild applause, because people know that will be less materials, less energy, and people are spending more time with each other, probably. Less things and more culture, family time, less time at jobs. And then on to equality, numbers in poverty, jobs, job satisfaction. And I hope we will be working less hours so that we have more time for those things that are more precious than anything and take less carbon. So I'm going to leave it there. That's a suggestion for some of the things that could happen and that changeover that hopefully we can all be part of. Thank you.
Super. Great. Wow, that was provocative. Over to Alice, our next provocateur.
Thank you, Gill. On that very optimistic note, I want to present something that I feel could be part of a solution. It's not a solution in its own right by any means. It's one part of the political process which can inform our discussions about responding to climate change. As many of you will know, Extinction Rebellion have called on the UK government to establish a citizens' assembly to tackle climate change. Can I have a quick show of hands, please? Who is familiar with the concept of a citizens' assembly? Okay, a lot of you. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what those are for those who are less familiar with the idea. I'm going to talk about the purpose and the form of a citizens' assembly, but some of the challenges and some of the potential impacts. Okay, so first of all, I'm an academic, so I'm sorry, there are a few slides and a few bullet points, but I'll keep them brief. So this is part of the political process. It's a form of participatory democracy, and it involves deliberation amongst citizens. It's a selection of citizens that are representative of the broader population that is being investigated or being involved in this discussion. It's usually a very structured and organised way of having that discussion, and it feeds into representative democracy. It's not a substitute. So it is usually tied into some political decision-making process, whether that's an public inquiry, whether it's a policy shift. It's a search for policy options. What happens is that citizens meet up, typically over the course of a couple of weekends, sometimes longer, sometimes over a series of weeks or even months. They listen to expert testimony. They read information. Often they read submissions from the public as well. They digest these, they discuss them and deliberate them with one another in groups, like you're going to do tonight in a short while. And they come up with some recommendations. They vote on them as groups, and those recommendations are ideally listened to by politicians and acted upon. This is one of the big challenges of citizens' assemblies, getting political buy-in from politicians, both to set them up and also to act upon the findings. They're often used in controversial or challenging areas where politicians can't find policy solutions, or where those solutions perhaps put politicians' careers at risk. They don't want to take a stance. Citizens can help them decide on these contentious issues. Just to give you an image here, this is the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland in 2015 and 2016. And as you can see here, we have some experts. They're giving their testimony, and the public are debating them in groups. Here we have some citizens poring over information, evidence, and discussing it, looking at it in great detail. And again, here they are asking questions to the experts, having their opportunity to put those questions, to seek clarification. So what are the kind of topics that a climate change citizens' assembly could look at? Some of the issues, the policy suggestions raised by Gill would be the type of things that would be discussed. First of all, what can individual citizens themselves do? And what are the blockages for individual behaviour change? What would citizens actually countenance doing? What do they really not want to do? Where does the resistance lie? And what is most difficult to change? And how could this process feed into a change in not only behaviour but in attitudes, the first step towards behaviour change? But what do citizens think governments should do, national governments and local governments, in terms of regulating businesses, in terms of regulating energy companies, in terms of reducing the prices of energy and finding solutions for people heating their homes in a sustainable way, for improving access to public transport, but in a just way, in a way that's fair to all. So these are some of the kind of topics that would be discussed. I'm going to present 5 possible challenges and then 5 possible impacts. I've mentioned this already. Gaining buy-in from political authorities could be difficult. There is appetite to do this amongst many local authorities. Other local authorities may prefer other forms of deliberation. It can be very complex for citizens to understand and grasp the complex climate science that's being presented to them, and the kind of effects of different policy options, the possible unintended effects, some of which Gill highlighted, of different policies. You have a relatively short space of time to come up with some conclusions and recommendations. In the course of deliberation, we have competing perspectives. Okay, there's animated debate. It's not always possible to achieve consensus, so it's difficult. You need effective facilitation. You need transparency to ensure that the process seems legitimate and fair for citizens, for those who are not involved in the Citizens' Assembly. Can they see that it's been done effectively and properly? And then maintaining involvement. This requires civic generosity on the part of citizens. They have to commit significant time to this. Okay, but some potential impacts. In this age of so-called anti-politics, political disenchantment, disillusionment, populism, there is absolutely a need to find new and innovative ways of engaging the public in our democratic processes. This is one of many types of deliberative and participatory democracy which can help achieve that. We also hope that these could potentially increase our understanding of the obstacles to individual action, to help us understand what it is that's holding individuals back and making changes in their own lives, but also getting the perspective of citizens on what politicians, both local and national, should be doing. But in a broader sense, this potentially could create momentum for more civic interest in climate change. You could envisage perhaps citizens' assemblies taking place 50 up and down the country, each with 100 people, 5,000 people in total taking part in this process, feeding back those results to government with media coverage of them. It could be quite exciting. Sometimes these citizens' assemblies produce very surprising recommendations that have been acted on by national governments, for example, in the Irish case. Okay, so some questions for you to consider. If there was a climate change assembly here in Devon, would you take part? Should there be one here? Do you feel it would generate political change? And could they be scaled up to have thousands of people taking part in these assemblies across the country? And a final question provoked by Pierre in our earlier discussions. Is the climate emergency is the situation such an emergency that we simply don't have time to engage in these deliberative forms of democracy that take time to develop? Do we have time to conduct citizens' assemblies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, at this stage, we are going to transfer. Our next provocateur is based down in Penryn in our Cornwall campus. Dr. Richard Hoggett. I hope you can see and hear him, and I hope you can hear me, Richard, as well. Over to you for your provocation.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me up there?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, great. So I was actually asked to give a kind of energy policy perspective. So I work in the energy policy group down here on Penryn campus. It's about 15 of us really working to look at how we transform the energy system. And that's really important because last year the UK, our use of energy in the UK accounted for about 80% of our carbon dioxide emissions. So if we want to tackle a climate emergency, we've got to fundamentally change our energy system. Now the issue is that the systems that are in place have evolved over decades. They're really complex. They involve millions of decisions made by millions of people and businesses. It's about how we heat and power our buildings. It's about how we move around. It's about what we buy and sell. It involves thousands of companies making investment decisions and developing businesses over long timescales. And we need all those decisions collectively to add up to an energy system that delivers the outcomes we need. We need a system which is net zero, secure, affordable, and it's got to be equitable. And our view in the energy policy group is that really can only happen if we get the governance right. And by that we kind of mean the rules, the regulations, the institutions, the politics behind it, all of which kind of shape the energy system. But the issue is the governance we've got in place has evolved alongside this energy system gradually over decades. And it's aligned with the system we have in place, mainly fossil fuels. And it's aligned with the actors which are in place. So it's totally unfit for the challenge of a climate emergency. And just to give a quick few examples, there's no kind of clear sense of direction. Different institutions and different parts of government work to different aims. There's confused signals, policies chop and change, meaning there's no certainty for investors, including people as investors. Financial incentives have aligned with financial incentives have to be aligned with the outcomes we want. Energy decision-making is largely being delegated from government to the regulator. There's a lack of coordination. Change has been left to the market. Key institutions sit in the private sector, and they're in competition with each other. They're not working for the public good. Recommendations from the Committee on Climate Change don't cascade down through the energy system at all. We've got lots of actors with no direct responsibility for for reducing carbon emissions and tackling climate change. And really, it's not just this national problem. We've got people who essentially drive the energy system right at the end and largely framed as passive consumers. The list is actually much longer. But if we want to tackle a climate emergency, we've got to turn all that on its head, really. And part of that is about a national thing. So there's no reason why we do not have a national declaration Parliament's voted for it, the government should declare a climate emergency. I think in the energy policy group, we would align with some of the other speakers, and we think we've got to push much harder and faster. We've got a kind of amazing track record in this country of setting targets way in the distance. We never get there. We set another one. So our view, kind of looking at what could be done within the energy system, is that we should be aiming for net zero by 2035. And to do that, and to declare an emergency at a national level, we think government should actually set up a kind of COVID-like approach. So there should be regular meetings tracking progress towards net zero. All government departments should have a carbon reduction duty, and they should have to report on progress. It should include kind of regular cross-party talks, meetings with devolved assemblies, regional mayors and combined authorities to really drive change and track progress. And it needs significant change in governance. So our view is actually what we need is an Energy Transformation Commission to work alongside the Committee on Climate Change, to coordinate and drive change from a local, a regional and a national level, and actually have a body which takes responsibility for transforming the energy system across heat, electricity and transport. It would need regulatory reforms, it would need changes to institutions. But it also really involves people. We need transparent and legitimate decision making so that actually all parts of society feel that they can be engaged and listened to. We have to bring in technical advice, yes, but we've also got to take account of society and individual preferences. And we need to put an emphasis on the role of people and the role of place. Energy systems are basically shaped by people. It's the way we live, the way we work, relax, get around, the goods and services we buy. And actually, some of the best solutions to try and transform the energy system are very local. It's about the local infrastructure. It's like, where is the electricity system? How constrained is it? Where's the gas network? What are the transport links like? What are the sort of buildings we're living in? It's those kinds of issues. So actually, we need to put people right in the heart of the energy system and see them as active citizens, connected with one another, with views and with influence. We need to find new ways, informally and formally, to engage and work with them and find solutions. They need to engage and give consent for change. Arguably, a lot of that means we have to take a much more local approach. It's about local authorities, parish and town councils. They should have duties to deliver on climate change, and that should be supported with advice and with funding from the central government. So that's what a climate emergency looks like to me. And I think it requires a completely new approach to energy governance and system change.
Thank you. Okay, we are 50 minutes in, more or less, to tonight's talk. And you've been listening to us talking to you for the last while. So it's going to change now. The idea is to give you guys a platform, both here and down in Cornwall, to ask us questions. Now, do you feel like you're at the stage where you've got questions ready to ask, or do you need a couple of minutes to think about it? What's the mood in the audience? Have we got any hands ready for questions that they would like to ask quickly? Okay, we've got a couple, but not so many. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer everybody 5 minutes to think about what you've heard and to come up with some more questions. So we've got more than 3 or 4 hands in a few minutes' time. So you have literally 5 minutes to think and talk to your neighbor and try and think about what is the most important question you think needs to be asked and aired in a few minutes' time. Off you go. Yep. Cool.
How do you want us to do the mic flip? Take two at a time?
We just...
Is it a meet up?
Yeah, definitely questions on subject. So the first thing I would say is that everybody needs to and then take a cluster probably area that is
I'll do this way.
But we'll start down in
Yeah.
Penryn. Okay. Okay. Shh. Thank you. I'm really sorry to curtail these conversations. It's just like one of my normal lectures, except you're probably actually talking about the topic rather than something else completely different. So I hope that's been useful to have a bit of a chat, get to know people, come up with some ideas. So we're going to start the next phase, which is going to run for approximately the next 45 minutes. And we're going to begin down in Cornwall, and we're going to see if there are any questions. Laura, I think it might be down there. Is there anybody down there who would like to start the ball rolling with some questions for the panel? And one thing I should say about process. So if you want to ask a question and you haven't got a mic in your hand, there's no point. Because the people down in Penryn, unfortunately, won't hear you. We want everybody to be able to hear it. Even if you're a very loud voice, it probably won't reach Cornwall. So we have a number of mics, both there and here. So please wait until a mic arrives to you before you start asking your question. Number two, keep your questions short. Maybe even shorter than some of our academic contributors so far. There's a challenge. Number three, we're going to take questions in short clusters. So rather than one question, one answer, we're going to do 2 or 3 questions and then answers from the panel. And then the final thing I just want to say is that our panelists are in front, and I haven't had a chance to introduce them all yet, but we have Sophie, we've got Richard Betts, who's a joint Met Office and University of Exeter appointment, and we have not just Gill, but we have 2 people, Diana Moore, who's a local city councillor in Exeter with the Green Party, welcome, and we have Glenn Woodcock from an organisation called Exeter City Futures. And when we get to the stage of questions, you feel free to say a little bit about where you're coming from and your interest in tonight. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to see if there are any questions down in our Cornwall campus, and anybody wants to ask and make a view known, short and pithy, to the panel. Off you go.
You have to get them to turn their mic on.
Have you turned your mic on? We can't hear. Okay, we've got a bit of a technical hitch. Does that mean you can't hear? Lovely.
Turn it back off, Michael. It's still muted, Michael. There we
Yay!
How about now?
Yay! Fantastic.
Okay, so I want to go back to something that Sophie said about reducing the voting age to 16. I don't know about how anyone else feels, but at my age, I feel like I have pretty much a lack of imagination, and children of that age and young people of that age, I think, deserve a voice. And I wonder if the panel think that is key to moving a lot of this forward so quickly, particularly with regards to letting them participate in citizens' assemblies.
Thank you for the question. Have we got 1 or 2 more questions from Penryn, please?
Yes, we do. Hi, thanks, guys. Amanda Brookman, I'm wondering what the university is thinking of in terms of a real relationship with its communities and how we can participate as equals. What sort of structures did you have in mind? Because we're ready.
Ooh, there's a challenge. Right, a lot of provocation coming up. Right, another question, please.
John Marshall, following on from Manda's comment then, or question then, the Civic University, if feels to be, as a member of the Climate Action Group, would the university be willing to cooperate, help climate action groups such as ours?
Okay, thank you very much for that. We'll throw that open to the panel. Now, none of the questions were addressed at one person in particular from what I can remember, so would anybody like to have a go? Richard, over to you then. You can start the ball rolling.
Yeah, thank you. So just to introduce myself, I'm Richard Betts. I'm chair in climate impacts here at the university. I'm part of the Global Systems Institute. I'm also head of climate impacts research at the Met Office. My area of research is on impacts of climate change. Can you hear me now? No? Well, I'm sorry, I can't do anything more about it, I'm afraid.
Well, maybe just slow down a tiny bit.
So, is it the speed or is it the volume? Anyway, so...
Can you hear it down in Penryn? You're too close to the mic.
Too close, okay. Right, how's that? So, and I'm also leading the main science for the UK's National Climate Change Risk Assessment as well. So the University of Exeter has a leading role in this national assessment. And one of the things actually I wanted to point out before I answer the question is that and I hope we can discuss this, is that it's a bit of a strange kind of emergency, the climate emergency, because it is true that we need to take urgent action if we are to reduce global warming to acceptable levels, but we won't see the consequences of whatever we do for some years. You often hear 12 years to save the world, but it doesn't mean the world's going to end in 12 years' time. We're not going to see a sudden climate disaster in 12 years. It's more insidious than that. Impacts are increasing all the time, but some of the worst will be a long time away, but we could become committed to them if we don't take urgent action. So it's a bit more subtle, this 12 years thing. But to come back to the question, I wanted to address the relationship with the communities question, the second question from down in Cornwall. So I think, yes, the university and academia in general should and will, I think, engage much more with local communities on this particular issue. And particularly in my area, I'm interested and I work on the impacts of climate change. And obviously, impacts on people is a priority there. And you can only really get to the heart of that if you talk to people who are being affected now or will be in the future. So we should not just be looking at it in a very kind of theoretical way. We should be engaging with both local communities here and around the world to understand what people think the threats are, what impacts they think they are already seeing. Many people are seeing changes in weather which are affecting them. And particularly in some of the poorer countries of the world and the hotter countries which are already on the edge, some people are starting to move to different parts of the country or even out of the country because they see the climate becoming more inhospitable for themselves. So we need to find out what is driving people for migration and so on. And I think that could be a big global issue, which is really important to address, but you can only get to it by engaging with people both locally and globally.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Sophie, would you like to respond to any of the questions?
So I'm also going to talk about the second question, which was about how to engage communities. So I genuinely think that we need to give more power to local governments. Oh, okay, sorry. I said for the second question about giving more, engaging the community more, I think we need to give more power to local governments because when I went with Fridays for Future to speak to Exeter City Council, a lot of the things that we wanted to do in the city, they passed either to the Devon County Council or to the central government, and that just felt like a really big obstacle for us because it was clear that the intentions of Exeter City Council were that they wanted to help us, but there was this like power kind of obstacle in the way. So,
okay, so that's an argument for structural change and to give local government more power than they have at the moment. Okay, I'm not sure if we've got anybody from the council here. We do actually, but they'll probably be chuffed at that idea. Dana, would you like to come in on it? And we have two other questions that haven't been touched on at all yet, so please do.
So I'm Diana Moore, I'm the Green Party councillor for St David's Ward, which covers St David's up to Devon County council offices and over to the incinerator and the quay on the other side. As you can see from my grey hair, I am not anywhere near Sophie's age, but when I was her age, I was campaigning for voting reform and votes at 16. So I'm really sad that 30 years on, Sophie is still making the same request, and that my daughter, when she gets to 18, will have missed the opportunity to vote in probably a number of general elections.
Aha.
So
anyway.
So we need votes at 16. I have met with Sophie and her group, and they are a highly competent, intelligent, engaged, organised and fantastic group of young people. And it is to their credit they have been organising some brilliant events, Fridays for Future, with engaging young people at school in this, to the extent that the head teacher of my daughter's schools today have said, you shall not take Friday off, we will do something at school in July. And I reply, but this is fantastic political education and they're doing it themselves, so we must support them. We, in terms of, in responding to Sophie's point and the point about communities, we need to enable councils to meaningfully engage with communities. Often there are consultations which are not clear about the purposes and the mechanisms for treating responses. The idea of a citizen assembly is really a very exciting one, because politicians are often very afraid of taking controversial decisions. So it's very easy to outsource those decisions to agencies and other bodies and working partnership, and they get lost in the myriad of day-to-day things. When you speak to people on the doorstep, people come very passionate, one way or the other, on what should happen to their food waste or other such issues. And actually having a citizens' assembly will actually enable people to work through the day-to-day difficulties of implementing these decisions, what it means, and come up with some good advice that should be heeded or even challenged by politicians, so that we know what we're letting ourselves in for. So I say, Exeter, we need a citizens' assembly.
Thank you very much. Gill Westcott.
I'd like to agree with that. I'd just like to mention two things about the role of the university. And first, to really acknowledge the helpful relationship this university has had with Transition Exeter in a number of respects, both relevant research projects and help in holding meetings like these, or hustings, or political meetings. And I see that more of that could invite more of the community into a relevant debate, which will help them to use their citizenship abilities more effectively. It would be great if it was less of a struggle for us to invite volunteers to help us from the university. We can't pay interns very often, but if that relationship could be a part of people's courses in some more organised way, it would be enormously helpful. And also, we've been invited to help and be partners in research projects with no benefits to us or no pay at all, and I would really like to be able to partner and to have the resources to be able to do it in ways that help with relevant research. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Glenn Woodcock.
I'm Glenn Woodcock. I'm a director of a community interest company called Exeter City Futures, which has been trying to think about what can be done to make Exeter a more sustainable place for the last 4 or 5 years. And I just want to address Sophie's point, because it took me 4 years to realise what it took you about 10 minutes to realise, which was about the kind of the way power is lacking in the organisations which represent us locally. Actually, I want to make a more subtle point than that, because actually I don't think it is lacking. We just don't know how to use it. It's spread amongst a lot of very complicated organisations which have been doing the same thing that they've been doing for the last 50 years maybe. And they've been doing a really good job at it. And I think we've all been really happy with it for quite a long time. Been building houses, connecting them to roads. We've all been able to buy cars. Everything's been pretty cool. And now we've realised that actually we're in a very difficult situation, and we've been going down a disastrous road. And the processes that we've been following that have led us there, nobody knows how to change. And we can change them, we just don't know how to do it. And that, I think, we can ask for central government to fix that for us, but really, it's for us in this area to work out. And in order to make that change, we have to deeply understand the reasons why people continue to do things the way they do them. And that is to do with the planning powers of all the district councils. It's to do with the transport planning powers of Devon County Council. It's to do with the way developers build houses and why they build them in particular places. It's to do with the ways investment happens. And at the moment, that happens according to a fairly, what's called laissez-faire approach. It's just whatever makes the most money. There are powers, but we don't know how to use them in a coordinated way. And I think it's very complicated, unnecessarily complicated. But if we want to make rapid progress locally, we have to understand it, and it's going to require a lot of imagination and people giving up on things that they thought they knew. And that is understanding each other's problems in a lot of detail. It's going to require patience, and it's going to require real determination to build over a period of time what I hope we can do, which is build a radical coalition amongst all of those what you might think as kind of fusty old tired authorities. They have to come alive, and it's people like you, Sophie, that can help them do that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so over to the audience here in the Streatham campus. So we're going to look for a knot of questions, 2 or 3, and I'm looking for a nice spread of gender and age, hopefully, so we're representative of the people in the room. So let me see. Let's start with this lady over here, and we've got a couple of hands up the left-hand side of the room. So if you could just remember to wait until the mic has got to you before you start speaking and make sure it's switched on. If you could be short and brief and speak slowly and clearly. Thank you.
Hi, it's really fantastic to hear 2 members of the panel talking about the growth economy and how we need to do something about that urgently. Really love Sophie's quote of we need to deconstruct the growth economy. But if we're an organisation like the Exeter University or a local authority that wants to take steps after having declared a climate emergency, but still participate in the economy at the moment, which is a growth economy, that's going to take quite a few years to change. What sort of steps can you take to actually start to deconstruct the growth economy in your particular organisation while still successfully participating in the country as it is right now?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, which was about how do you make those steps? How do you start to have fundamental economic change? So, second question, left-hand side, thank you.
Ricardo Noble, student here in the University of Exeter. And I would like to know what can we do about international companies that are acting and that go beyond the authority of local powers, because we are seeing how they are abusing the global south, and countries are being exploited by these companies, and they are being destroyed, and they are suffering the most sudden and worst effects of climate change. So what can we do as citizens about these companies?
Okay, great question. Thank you very much. And, oh, okay, yeah, one popped up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about universities and what they might be thinking about doing in terms of always expanding the numbers of students, and obviously the emphasis on international students and how we square that circle or whatever in terms of the flights and the large quantities of flights that impacts on.
Okay. Yeah, and the final question up at the back, that gentleman who's got his hand up. And then we'll go to the panel for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just had a question to the members of the panel tying into the graph that the second speaker showed us regarding the reduction in emissions of carbon dioxide across the different sectors. The graph showed that there has been reductions in the industrial and energy production sectors. Can you hear me?
Yeah, proceed.
There have been reductions in 2 of the sectors which were mentioned in the graph, Whereas if we aim to reach the goals of zero net emissions, we would need to reduce in the other sectors which were mentioned, such as housing and transport as well. Do the members of the panel believe that there is any realistic chance of reducing these in the coming 6 to 10 years to reach the net zero emissions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to the panel. Who would like to start?
Jill had a hand up, but I'll do it all.
Off you go, Glenn.
I'll talk about is there a chance of reducing emissions? There are many forces at work, and there are many political forces at work simultaneously. We all know that. I mean, outside of this room, everyone else is thinking about Theresa May and Brexit, and and what's going to happen on Friday, on Tuesday after the European elections. One of the big forces is house building at the moment. There is an enormous amount of house building in the UK. Potentially up to 50,000 houses may be built in the greater Exeter region. I was in Colchester a couple of weeks ago where they're looking at building 250,000 new houses, and this is not unusual for a county to be looking at that kind of growth. As it stands, the easiest thing to do, and this is what's happening in most places, is to build those houses by motorway junctions on greenfield sites and allow people to buy cars to be able to access jobs from those houses. Now, that is not a good way to reduce our CO2 emissions. And even if we were to assume that relatively soon in the future, every one of those people was driving an electric vehicle, we can't generate that much electricity. So there is a very, very important thing that we can be doing now, which is looking at the way we do plan, the way new housing is being built. And I think to go further than that, is there something we can do about the existing use of cars and transport to move people around based on the kind of housing that's being built? And I think there is. But it does require local authorities to take much more control of what kind of land is being developed and to use the profits from the way that land is being developed to invest in transport infrastructure. So I think there are plans emerging, and I think there's quite a lot of interest on both sides of the political divide. I mean, even John McDonnell's quite interested in things like regional investment banks to take advantage of the way land is developed and invest that in infrastructure. And that's something that we're actually looking at here in Exeter as well. It's very early days, and there's a lot of forces that work against it. But those are the sorts of things that I think, locally, if we can get behind and change the flavour of the way development's happening, not stop it, but to help it to happen in different ways, and to help the proceeds from that go into investment in other kinds of infrastructure to reduce the number of personal cars that are needed for us to move around. So I think there are some specific actions that can be taken.
Great.
Sorry.
Okay.
Too long.
I'd like to let someone else in. Yep, Jill.
What a lot of questions, blimey.
You don't have to answer all of them, by the way. Just one will be fine.
Uni, if I understand your question, is it how to change the growth economy? Is that?
How to do that as an individual organisation if the country is going to take so long?
Okay, the country's different, and for the country to transition, I could suggest some things, but I think for the university, we are already seeing a movement of the syllabus, and I think in the business school, this is a really important area. Transition Exeter has sought cooperation over the years, but has found little overlap with people in the business school. We have, and there's been a two-way thing, but I think some of the, and this is not restricted to Exeter, the paradigms of economic science are just very blinkered. They talk about, there's a pecking order. The more maths you get, the better it is, and the more you get invited. So I think looking at the syllabus there, and I know this is partly on the agenda there, multinational companies exploiting global south. There are some things that individuals can do. Ecocide law is waiting and would make a profound difference. Individuals can join Mission Life Force. It has a new name, but you can still find it by searching there. And if crimes of ecocide could be brought internationally, I think it would make a big difference to multinational companies. The other thing that can be done is to support the divestment movement. One can move one's account to a bank or place that doesn't invest in fossil fuels, such as Triodos or the Co-op or Nationwide. And some banks are worse than others. But one can also support the movements for divestment. And I know there has been a lot of thought about university and academics' pension funds, county councils' pension funds. Diana, your city council pension funds. And I think it's something the university could very usefully investigate and promote. Lastly, house building. Some people here who are involved in local authorities will understand very well why local authorities have been unable to control the development in their areas. And it's because power has been removed from them. Britain is the most centralised state of, I think, any in Europe. What local authorities need is the planning powers that they used to have and more, so that they can reject proposals which have a bad climate impact, that have a profound impact, and to be able to actively plan and shape development in such a way that it's compatible with our carbon budgets. And I think they should be asking and clamouring for central government to provide those powers, as well, one would hope, as budgets, to be able to take a full part in the investment needed for a zero carbon society.
Thank you, Joe. Diana Moore.
I think we need three things. We need cooperation, we need some courage, and we need some changed priorities. In the point about the ever onward growth economy, in my day job, I work with social and community enterprises, real businesses that are doing real trade in real communities, involving local people, both as members and investors, shareholders, that are producing their own, meeting their own needs through their own businesses. So the more we can do to support local cooperatives is really exciting. And one of the moves that's happening across the region is to set up a Southwest Mutual Bank. And that's really important to promote a more local and resilient economy that can also enable trade to meet social and environmental ends, as well as creating wealth. But we need that wealth to be kept in communities and not fly away through the ever Ponzi scheme, or that is inward investment, that weakens economies and takes people's jobs away at the first sign of any trouble. So in terms of courage, we do need decision makers to have the courage and use the powers that are actually there. So last year there was a new policy planning framework for land use set out, and within that, local authorities were given the power to set higher energy standards for building homes. I asked an officer about that. It hasn't yet been tried out. Local authorities live in fear of the developers and their solicitors who will challenge decisions. But we have to have the courage to say, building these homes at that level of energy efficiency, which is usually no more than the building regulations, is not good enough. And it's not good enough for the climate, and it's not good enough because it's locking in future fuel poverty. These issues relating to the environment really do relate to inequality and poverty, and it is really sad that we have a relatively affluent city here in Exeter, but inequality is rising between the poorest and the worst heated streets in Exeter and the best insulated streets in Exeter. I believe the difference in life expectancy is 10 years. Now, that might not be quite accurate, but you can check it on the Wellbeing Exeter website. It's quite a shocking impact that fuel poverty will have on people's lives. So we also need to change priorities. So, for example, Exeter City Council's current planning policy gives a 50% discount to the developers of purpose-built student blocks. Now, these blocks are having a significant impact on St David's. They're having a significant impact on the lives of residents, but they're also having a significant impact on the lives of students who are struggling to pay the luxury fees that go with the luxury blocks. These developers do not need a 50% discount on the levy that developers pay. They need to be paying the full whack and contributing to the infrastructure of our community.
Okay. Did you want to come in, Rich?
So I can address a couple of the points that have been made. Firstly, on the international companies question, and Gill mentioned divestment. There is actually, it's now much easier to find out where your money is going. About 6 months ago, the Bank of England set up a group called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So major companies now, it's still voluntary, it's not legal, but they're voluntarily disclosing their exposure to climate change impacts, their links to their use of fossil fuel, and the amount that's committed in part of their business, and their liability as well. So there's now a framework coming into place where you can actually see where investments are going. So that can help with decision making there. In terms of the sectoral emissions that Pierre presented, and there was a question about can any of the sectors reduce more? Yes, several of them could reduce more fairly easily, actually. Many of the sectors are well behind targets set by the UK government under the Climate Change Act 10 years ago. So Glenn has already mentioned transport and house building. So there is potential there to improve emissions reductions. Land use emissions, reducing those, or net emissions, are well behind target. There's much more reforestation, rewilding could be done, changing land management practices as well. There's a lot of potential there. But also waste as well. If you look carefully at Pierre's graph, you would have seen that the waste emissions have gone down. One of the interesting things there is food waste. Food waste going to landfill becomes a source of methane, and which is a really strong greenhouse gas. So if you don't throw your food waste to landfill, then that helps to reduce that as well. A lot more could be done there. But also, and this perhaps links back to the international companies question as well, the thing that wasn't on Pierre's graph, because it's not part of the UK's official emissions inventory, is what's called offshore emissions. Basically, a lot of our stuff gets made elsewhere in the world. We've exported our emissions. We buy loads of stuff from lots of countries in Asia and so on. So we've exported those emissions, but they're still ours. So when you buy plastic tat from elsewhere in the world, it's been shipped around the world at huge carbon expense. Those are still your emissions. So buying less stuff can also help reduce emissions as well. So there's a lot that we can do.
Thank you very much, Rich. Super. Sophie?
So this is also in response to the question about international companies. I'd just like to raise awareness of, well, I feel like talking about social media as a teenager is quite expected, but through this movement, we've met people who are doing exactly the same thing as what we're going to be doing tomorrow, which is striking school in Colombia and in Brazil, and in areas that are already facing much worse climate impacts than we are. And their governments are responding very harshly to them. Their police are acting very aggressively towards them, especially in Brazil, where the government is largely anti-climate change completely. So I would just recommend to everyone to keep up with these issues, to share these stories, because they're not getting told. We hear about Greta Thunberg and the amazing work she's doing, but there are activists facing extreme consequences for what they are doing, and I think their stories need to be shared as well to increase the pressure on such companies and governments.
More questions, please. Let's see some hands. Okay, there's some at the back there. I can see 3 at the top. There's a knot of 3. There's 2 women and a man. Somebody with a yellow sleeve. Yeah. Okay, so we'll take you 3 next, and then we'll move around the room next time.
Hi. We talk about a need to deconstruct the growth economy, and by extension, I guess that means capitalism. How do we go about changing values on such a large scale?
How do we go about...
Changing values on such a large scale.
Okay, excellent question. Over to the next questioner, please. Changing values on a large scale and maybe rapidly as well. Yep.
Thank you. In response to Gill's hopeful vision for the future, my question is, how do we get there without leaving people behind? I'm a trustee for Food Exeter, and we're working with very disadvantaged people. And food poverty is becoming a huge issue in this city and across the country. So how do we put in sort of carbon allowances and things like that that don't affect the most vulnerable?
Thank you. And then just in front, yep.
Various sectors have been talked about, and apart from a quick mention from Sophie, the media hasn't come up. So in all its various forms and at all its various levels, local through to international, what should the role of the media be in response to climate urgency?
Great question. Thank you very much. Okay, let's take those to the panel. Who would like to go first? The academic.
Yes.
Right.
Of course.
Over to you, Rich.
The last question kind of caught my attention. What's the role of the media? Talk about it properly, just don't sensationalise it the whole time. Basically, the media, it's so polarising. It's either got to be, oh, it's all a lie, it's all a hoax, or there's absolute catastrophe next Thursday. There's a lot more complexity to it, and we're not having the proper conversation that we need to have. The polarised media just sets people against each other. I would like the media to be much more responsible and promote a proper conversation and not just do it to sell newspapers.
Thank you very much. Sophie, do you want to come in? No? Okay. Glenn, over to you.
I'm going to be brave and have a crack at how do we change values on a large scale.
Whoa.
I mean, I think one of the key things is not to think of this issue in isolation, because our daily lives, the thread of our daily lives, isn't just about climate change. It's about all sorts. It's about the quality of our whole lives, and I think we've got all sorts of things messed up at the moment. At school, what seems to be most important is that you can get 13 A-star, no, not A-star, grade 9 GCSEs, but not that you can, enjoy playing a musical instrument or enjoy the fitness of your young body playing sport. And we're not learning in our young years how important it is to support the people around us and to have a kind of a mentally and physically healthy life, and that and not learning that those things are the most important things in our lives, and not learning what it is to be part of a community. So I think begin there. And so begin with really looking hard now at the education system and what we expect from it. And I actually think that we can probably do that locally. Why do we need to wait for central government to change the way the curriculums are set? It's really down to us as parents, how to encourage our children, what's important and what isn't, and then to put pressure on our schools to represent that in their daily lives.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
I quite agree, and my daughter came home the other day and said they'd studied Greta Thunberg's speech recently, so that was encouraging. I mean, the question about values on a large scale is a very difficult one, because I don't think cloning David Attenborough is yet possible. But we need to have people open their eyes at a speed and a scale which is sort of quite incomprehensible to us. So it does have to start with grassroots activism. And also we have to change our mindset so that we really understand that creating a decent life for everybody within the environmental limits of one planet means that our economy is just a means to get there and not be all and end all. And that simple thinking through is actually quite a shift in people's thinking. And the question about how we get there without leaving people behind is absolutely fundamental. As I said earlier, inequality in Exeter is rising, and we need to talk about that. we can't assume that growth can be inclusive. We have to actually really understand what the needs of people are and why it's so difficult to ensure their needs are met. And many of the issues that I hear about when people talk to me on the doorstep is that the system has very much let people down, and people are really struggling with that. And on top of that, ill health and other personal circumstances all combine to make dealing with issues such as the environment seem as a luxury. But it's not. Some other residents I know have been who live in a poorer part of St David's, live along a major road, and there air pollution is really unacceptable. And all the residents along this particular section of the road have told me about their health problems. One has moved from the front of her house to the back of her house to sleep because of the air pollution. Another has a letter from her doctor saying air pollution has contributed to her bad health. So these things don't live in a separate category of environmental things over there. It directly affects people. So I don't have an answer to that other than we have to see it as an interconnected system, and that we have to change the system and not the climate. Sorry, a bit of a cliche there, but it's so important.
Thank you very much. All the questions were responded to, so I'm actually going to go back out, and then we'll come back to you, Gill. So do we have any more hands? Oh, God, we've got tons of hands, but we've only got a limited amount of time. Okay, so I'm really asking people to keep questions brief and to the point. So we've got a couple up the right here we haven't managed to reach yet. Is that one up at the back? Yep, sorry, is that somebody in Penryn? Yep, we'll get to you in a minute. We've just got a couple here. We will get to you, don't worry. Yep, yep. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Right, yeah, there's one up the top. There's a few up the top, yep.
Hello?
Yep.
Is it on?
Yeah, if you could.
Just a really quick one. How do you think that you can make the youth voice more heard? Because I feel like it's even discouraging people to vote because they don't feel like their voice is very heard in this sort of area. So it's more one for Sophie, particularly. Yeah.
Okay, question for Sophie about how we can actually enable the voices of youth to be heard. One more question up there, yep.
Yeah, so as researchers at this university, if we want to do an experiment on humans or animals, we have to fill in mountains of ethics paperwork, and rightly so. But if we want to take a flight on university business, we just have to book a ticket. So should there not be a way to evaluate the ethics of our research activities from a carbon point of view?
Okay, I think Penryn are very keen to come in, so let's see if they've got any questions. Yes, we can.
Extinction Rebellion asked for a citizens' assembly, and it does seem that they deserve something for their success, and I can't really think why we can't get on with it. So maybe a bit of a cul-de-sac to sit in Devon and Cornwall, but reaching out to people in Hull and a tower block in Birmingham. Is there a way of asking every local authority that has had a climate emergency decision to contribute £5,000 to do the very scientifically selection procedure, a bit like Willy Wonka and the Golden Ticket, and we can take the narrative to a National Citizens' Assembly ourselves without central government, and could the University of Exeter lead on this?
Okay, was there a second question from Penryn? I think we've had one.
I'm hearing the term, I believe, human being spoken about a lot. I'm not hearing the term of plant being, animal being.
Yep. Go on.
Address 4% that's left. That is 96% gone. How do we stop that and prevent that and stop thinking about us and our buildings and our cars and our planes and our way of life?
Excellent.
World, planet, Earth way of life.
Thank you very much. Okay. Sophie, do you want to start? So over to Sophie. There was a particular question about youth, and then we'll open it up to the panel to take those questions in.
So something that we are I mentioned it in my speech, that we're working with the UK Student Climate Network. It's very similar to the concept of a citizens' assembly, but it's actually a youth assembly. And we are basically asking for these assemblies to be set up across the country with a cross-section of youth to talk specifically about climate change, but it could easily expand to other issues, because at the moment the only youth body that we have is the Youth Parliament, which I feel is largely symbolic and is used to just help people get into politics rather than make any actual policy changes. So we want to see firm recognition that we do have a say, and I think the youth strikes is a really good way to show that we're active in this, and then I think having a youth assembly would validate the entire thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody else on the panel want to come in to some of those extremely provocative questions? Gill has been waiting, obviously, for a bit. Offer to you.
Giving priority to other beings than human, I find a very challenging question. And I have to look beyond our culture to find some ways of doing it. There are traditions of council which involve representation of other beings. For example, the Council for All Beings, but many traditional societies have these ways. There's also a tradition in some groups of giving a voice to children for the 7th generation. And I think both those could be experimented with while we're looking at decision-making, governance, citizens' assemblies. Perhaps we could make some adventures in that way to find out how we could change our culture and our values. And I could say more about ways of doing that. I also wanted to say ethics for flights, yes. Citizens' assemblies all over the country, yes. But I suppose lurking underneath here is also the predominance of wealth in the way that our media, particularly our newspapers and our social media work. Social media reach is enormously dependent on wealth, and so is printed media. It's too much to go into in detail, but I think that food poverty is another result of the great inequalities in our society, and it's not enough to speak blamingly about it. This is not a personal thing, but there are policies, not just tax and benefit, which is too politically vulnerable, but relating to our money creation and wealth ownership. So interest redistributes from poor to rich. Changes would involve land value tax. They would involve embedding public good in the governance of corporate bodies. That can be done by the rise of social enterprises, but there are many other ways where other businesses, and Glenn is an outstanding example of this, he should be talking about this, not me, how public value can be embodied in the governance of existing commercial enterprises. I think that dealing with inequality is vital to moving in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Another person from the panel, or shall we go back to the audience? Yeah, Janet, briefly then.
Two things. I think in relation to the issue of biodiversity and other beings, I think that's a really fundamental point. And I think that coming back again to the planning system, it's only treated in terms of building stuff. And actually particularly green spaces and how land is to be landscape is often treated as a matter to be decided a bit later once the building's put up. We need to ensure that the land use planning system fundamentally protects trees, hedgerows, and ensures landscapes are brought forward which actually make sure they are protected and developed. And the most ironic thing within the planning system is the suitable alternative natural green spaces that are set up in place of the green fields that have been built all over. So we need to fundamentally think about planning, and I would really encourage you to spend your spare time in your evenings looking at the planning applications pages and putting in objections to those trees that are going to be felled in conservation areas, and looking in detail at planning applications about how they're going to look at land use. So there you go, that's one exciting thing to do. Exeter City Council decided that it wouldn't approve a climate emergency when the Greens and Lib Dems brought forward a motion earlier in the year. And they have, however, signed up to having an ambition to be net zero carbon by 2030. That ambition amounts to nothing unless there's action to follow it through. So we need to make sure that local authorities do actually implement and take seriously the decisions that they're made now. It's a very sobering thought that I have been elected for a period of 4 years, which is a third of the time in which action is required to actually avert climate catastrophe. So we need action and decisions now. So I invite all political parties to steal my agenda from me as soon as you can.
Okay. Right, we're going to move to the next stage, which is a stage which gives power back to the audience to vote on a number of questions. We're going to move into the next and penultimate part of the evening, which is the stage of voting. So we need to bring up some questions and maybe offer some instructions as to procedure. Okay? Now, if anybody does not have access to a smart device with Wi-Fi access, if you could please let us know. We do have a number of sheets of paper and pens for people who need that and who still want to participate in the voting. So if you could put your hands up high, we'll make sure that those materials get to you right now. Yeah, so who needs a paper and pen to engage in the voting? Have we got the materials? Oh, I see. Okay, sorry. All right, we've got a ballot box down here. It's not a European election ballot box, so those people who want to vote that way, yeah, we'll just circulate those materials now. If anybody's got any questions about this procedure, let us know. Okay.
Do you want me to put the first question up?
Yeah. But we've got, I think we had a hand or a couple of hands in Penryn there. Well, yeah, okay, great, it's going around, brilliant. Okay, so the first question is up. Yeah, okay, have a look at the question and then we'll go back to the instructions. Is climate change the most important emergency we face as a society? Let's go back to the instructions, though, so people... Yeah,
hang on. Let's let this one take over.
Yeah, can you go back to the instruction thing? Yeah, okay, we're getting there, we're getting there.
The web address to go to is ex.ac.uk/Exeter Climate.
Yeah, could you...
Yeah.
Could you show it again, though, just for a sec, and then go back to
I'll show it once this question's gone on. If I do that, it resets the whole thing.
Oh, does it? Okay. Shame. Okay. So, what's it called again? x.ac.uk/Exeter
Climate.
Okay. So the web address is ex.ac.uk/Exeter Climate.
And then just click join. Don't need to fill anything in.
Question one, and we can put yes or no if that's how you want to do it.
Yeah, that's fine.
It is anonymous.
Thank you.
Unless you put your name in, and then it's not.
Yeah.
Asking how to respond on paper. Yeah, what do you do on paper?
Yeah, so if you've got a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, annotate this as question 1. Question 1.
They can do either A or B.
And then you can respond A or B, yes or no. That's question 1. So I think we're nearly ready to move on to question 2. There are some hands still up at the back of the room. We have loads more pencils. Is there a shortage of pencils? There's no paper. Oh, shortage of paper, okay. Not quite as many smartphones in the room as we might have assumed, perhaps. Okay, can we move on to question 2?
That's the link again, just in case anyone needs it.
Ask people who've got paper tickets if they can write on them instead.
Yeah, I mean, those people who haven't received a blank sheet of paper, if you've got any sheet of paper on you whatsoever, and you write this on, we can put it in the ballot box and take your vote into account. So you don't need our paper, you need just paper. So yeah, we've got somebody being great. So, question 2, will framing climate change as an emergency actually lead to action? Yes or no? Tell us what you think. Question 2. Oh. Will framing climate change as an emergency actually lead to action? I mean, I guess we're all here, so there's been something that's happened, but it depends what you mean by action. Anyway, will framing climate change as an emergency actually lead to action? Okay, and in a couple of minutes' time, we'll move on to question 3. Right, on to question 3. Good, we've had 200 responses, that's good. Do you support the formation of a citizens' assembly to address climate change?
Hang on a second. There we go. Should work now.
I know this question is a little bit ambiguous in the sense of whether it's a local one or a national one or a concerted local and national one. However, if we put those nuances aside just for now, do you support the formation of a citizens' assembly to address climate change? We've got 170 responses and climbing. Let's get up to 200 before we move on. Do you support the formation of a citizens' assembly to address climate change? Okay, everybody had a chance to vote on that? Great. Okay, on to our next question then. What we'll do at the end of this is just show them all the final results, and then we'll have some final remarks and conclusions. Should it be more expensive to buy things that contribute towards climate change? And I guess it's worth thinking through the implications of your answer to this for yourselves as much as everybody else, but everybody in society. Should it be more expensive to buy things that could contribute towards climate change? Should there be price signals related to carbon emissions? Okay, I think politicians generally assume that people are averse to tax rises or taxes of any kind, so this is an interesting question to pose. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question, because they get a bit more complicated as they go along.
I hope so, yeah.
Do you think the government should move support from fossil fuels, away from fossil fuels, and towards renewable energy sources? Yes or no? All right. I think there's at least one person with a sense of humor in the audience, maybe? Okay, on to the next question. Right. Oh, yes. So we're moving from a binary yes-no to a multiple choice question. Which of the following should be subject to a carbon tax? Yeah, actually, you should be able to. Is the answer yes-no to all then? Is this 5 questions?
I think you can only pick one.
Ooh, okay, so prioritize. We're asking you to prioritize. Okay, apologies if this isn't quite perfectly nuanced in the wording. Yeah, with the slides, okay. So prioritize, which is the most important one? Okay, maybe all of them need to be carbon tax, but if you had to start with one, which would you start with? Is it air travel? Is it to do with road traffic travel? Heating? Meat products? Or dog food? Dog food. Okay. Okay.
I think that's the last question.
On to the next question. Is that all of them? Okay, can we just show the answers then?
I think so.
Can I just say that obviously some people have voted by hand, so you're not going to see their responses up on the board. Everybody who has registered for this event has provided us with your email address. Thank you very much. What we're going to do is we're going to return you with an email which has all of the slides that have been shown for your information and the answers to the questions as well. And you'll also be given a link if you want to watch any of this again. If you've got any spare time in your evenings when you're not objecting to planning applications or writing to central government to campaign about more powers being given to local authorities, etc. So, are we able to show them?
It didn't store the answers on this one, so if people want to vote again, that would be great. Sorry. It should come back up again.
Okay, see if you...
The Citizens' Assembly.
Well...
It's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so we have roughly 90% support for a Citizens' Assembly. That's interesting. I don't know if anybody from Devon County Council is in the audience, but they've certainly been actively considering doing just that. And we at the university are interested in collaborating on that too. Other questions? Okay.
Can you see that? Yeah.
Can we move on to the question about dog food at some point? I'm quite interested in finding that. Oh, right. Okay, so start with air travel. And of course, this is a direct provocation to the university. For example, I'm due to attend a IPCC event in New Delhi in India in October. So I probably should leave tomorrow because I'm going to need to get there by bicycle or not. But there are enormous inbuilt inertias and difficulties, even in a body like the IPCC, which is supposed to be talking about climate change and has meetings all over the world. So, as Mark said, as a university, we have just set up a review panel led by Professor Juliet Osborne to look into these issues and what we can do as a body. But we can't do that alone. It has to be done collaboratively as well, locally. And we've had some very provocative questions about institutional change and changing power relations across society. We have just a few moments left. And I think, apart from thanking all of our panelists, all of our questioners in the 2 different campuses, all the people who've turned up tonight and come along to the university, I just wanted to give the last word to Sophie. Would you like to say any closing remarks before we conclude this evening?
There's a strike tomorrow.
Yay!
I think, you don't have to be young to come. It's 11 o'clock at Devon County Hall. So far, we've sent emails to all our councillors, but we haven't received anything back apart from 2 Lib Dems, I think. And so we've basically been asking them to come so we can ask them about what they're doing, and they haven't replied. So, if we could get as biggest crowd there as possible, if we could get chanting, maybe we can kind of encourage them to come out of the building because we really want some interaction.
Okay, thank you very much.
11. AM.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. We're going to leave it there. Hopefully there will be other events of this kind soon. Please come back again and join us. Thank you very much. Oh, gosh. Sorry, I just forgot there are a couple of events coming up that are coming up soon. So we've got a couple of slides just to show you if you'd like to attend, in particular at the end of July, about James Lovelock and systems thinking. And can I do anything about climate change? Yes, you can, 31st of July. Thank you.
Sorry, that was my fault.
Thanks for your help.
That's
Sorry,
okay.
you're welcome. You all right?
Excuse me. Yeah. How do you do?
I'm going to the Natalie Fanny.
Oh, did you? I think I remember.
And email.
Did you?
I'm going to report. I don't know.
What do you need me to do now?